Evelyn Harper moved through the sprawling living room of their penthouse, her hands gently resting on her swollen belly as she adjusted the holiday decorations. The soft glow of fairy lights reflected off the polished surfaces, casting a warm glow over the carefully curated space, yet beneath the surface perfection, a tension gnawed at her. 8 months pregnant, she could feel her baby shifting inside her, each tiny kick a reminder of the life she carried and the responsibility that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She glanced toward the grand window overlooking the city skyline, hoping Lucas Trent, her husband, would join her, share a smile, or at least a word of warmth, but he was nowhere in sight. Lucas was a man consumed by ambition, a successful businessman whose every thought seemed tied to meetings, deadlines, and, lately, someone else. Evelyn had noticed the subtle cracks in their marriage, the curt responses when she tried to engage him, the way his eyes flicked nervously toward his phone, and the late-night messages that he quickly silenced when she entered the room. She forced herself to ignore the unease building in her chest, convincing herself that perhaps he was just stressed, that the demands of his career had temporarily clouded his attention. Yet something deep inside whispered otherwise, a quiet warning she tried not to hear. The ping of a notification broke the silence, and Evelyn's gaze shifted to Lucas's phone lying on the coffee table. The screen illuminated a message from Isabella Kane. Evelyn's stomach dropped, a cold ripple of dread coursing through her. She didn't need to read it to understand the implication, the tone, the secrecy, the timing, all of it hinted at betrayal. Lucas, in that moment, remained oblivious to the stirrings of her awareness, preoccupied with responding to messages that belonged nowhere near their family. Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying herself as she returned her attention to the decorations, hiding the tightening in her chest. She loved Lucas, had invested years of hope and patience into their marriage, and carried a life they had created together. But beneath the twinkling lights and polished surfaces, a storm was quietly brewing, one that threatened to upend everything she had built, leaving cracks that could no longer be ignored. The perfect life they displayed to the world was beginning to crumble, and Evelyn sensed it with every instinct she had. Evelyn had gone to straighten Lucas's briefcase, a routine gesture she had performed countless times over the years, when a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. Curiosity and a slight unease made her bend down, and the message scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting caused her heart to stop. It was a note from Isabella Kane, Lucas's mistress, filled with casual, intimate words that left no doubt about the betrayal. The shock hit her like a physical blow, her chest tightening as tears blurred her vision. She sank onto the couch, the note trembling in her hands, struggling to process the depth of Lucas's duplicity. Years of small neglect now crystallized into a painful pattern. She remembered the countless prenatal appointments he had promised to attend but missed without explanation, the evenings she had waited for his return while he entertained Isabella in luxurious restaurants, the whispered reassurances of love that never materialized into meaningful action. Each memory now cut sharply, a reminder that the man she had trusted implicitly had repeatedly chosen someone else over the family they were supposed to protect. The heartbreak was suffocating. It was more than infidelity, it was a rejection of everything she had sacrificed, every hope and dream she had placed in their marriage. Anger flared, mingled with an icy resolve. Evelyn's mind raced as she considered her options. She could no longer remain in this home, in this marriage, pretending that all was well for the sake of appearances or Lucas's convenience. Her priority had shifted completely, the safety and well-being of herself and her unborn child. She began to plan quietly, methodically, imagining a life away from Lucas, a life where she could breathe without fear of betrayal shadowing every decision. Every small detail mattered, where they could go, what she would need, how to leave without confrontation. She knew Lucas would not take her departure lightly, and his ego and attachment to control could make the process volatile. But Evelyn's maternal instinct and self-preservation overrode fear. As the storm of grief and anger settled into clarity, she realized one thing with unwavering certainty: she would no longer be a bystander to Lucas's betrayal. She would act, and she would protect her child at all costs, even if it meant walking away from the life she had once believed was perfect. The sound of the city outside their penthouse windows seemed unusually loud that evening, a distant reminder of the life moving on without her involvement. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her swollen belly, her eyes scanning the empty apartment. Lucas had not come home, and the chill in the air was not just from the winter night but from the emotional void he had created. She knew where he was, entirely aware that he had chosen to spend the night with Isabella Kane, leaving her alone, vulnerable, and pregnant. The realization burned through her, a mix of anger, fear, and despair that made it hard to breathe. She had tried for months to convince herself that things might improve, that Lucas would notice her needs, that he would finally put his family first. But this night, like so many before, revealed the truth. He was indifferent to her well-being, to the life growing inside her, and to the sacrifices she had made for their marriage. The betrayal was no longer abstract, it was vivid, tangible, and undeniable. Every message from Isabella, every secretive gesture he had made, now culminated in this one brutal reality. Evelyn's hands clenched, and a quiet resolve began to form. She could not allow her life, or her child's future, to be dictated by Lucas's selfishness. She would act, and she would do so decisively. Rising from the bed, she moved to the closet, methodically selecting the essentials: clothes, blankets, toiletries, a few cherished items for herself and the unborn child. Every movement was deliberate, a silent declaration of independence and determination. On the kitchen counter, she placed a set of divorce papers, neatly organized and ready for Lucas to find. There was no note of anger, no words of accusation, only a clear, unambiguous statement of her intentions. She wanted no confrontation, no drama, just action that ensured her safety and that of her child. By the time the first hints of dawn crept across the city skyline, Evelyn had vanished. The apartment was empty, the air still, save for the faint echo of the life that had once been contained within its walls. Lucas would awaken to an empty home, the divorce papers glaring at him like a warning, and a profound absence he could neither ignore nor undo. Evelyn had acted with precision and courage, taking control of her destiny and protecting the future she would now shape alone, at least for the moment. Lucas awoke to an unfamiliar quiet, the absence of Evelyn's soft morning movements immediately unsettling him. His eyes darted across the spacious bedroom, landing on the neatly stacked divorce papers on the nightstand, their presence sharp and accusatory. Panic surged through him, a physical weight pressing on his chest, as he realized the enormity of what had happened. Evelyn was gone, and with her, the life he had taken for granted. His first instinct was disbelief. Surely this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that could be corrected with a simple call or explanation. But as he ran through the empty apartment, the truth became undeniable. The home that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now echoed hollowly, amplifying his shock. Confusion and anger collided within him. How had she managed this without him noticing? Why had she left without a word, without confronting him directly? His thoughts spun, unrelenting, each one a bitter reminder of his failures. As he searched every room, checking closets, the kitchen, even the balcony, fragments of memory assaulted him. Missed prenatal appointments, the nights he had spent laughing and dining with Isabella Kane, the empty promises he had whispered to Evelyn, all these moments now coalesced into a damning pattern of neglect. His obsession with Isabella had blinded him, made him indifferent to the woman who had stood by him, to the child growing inside her, and to the family that had once been his world. The reality struck with brutal clarity: his choices had consequences, consequences he could not simply undo. The betrayal he had allowed, nurtured even, had driven Evelyn away, leaving him alone in the life he had once controlled. Isabella, the mistress he had prioritized over his family, was the catalyst for the collapse of the home he had ignored, and for the first time, Lucas felt the sharp sting of understanding. The family he had taken for granted was gone, and the weight of his failures pressed on him, leaving no room for excuses, only recognition of the life he had irreversibly damaged. Evelyn drove for hours under the cover of night, the city lights of her old life fading in the rearview mirror as she focused on the road ahead. Every mile carried her further from Lucas Trent, from betrayal, from the life that had once seemed so secure. The distant city she had chosen was unfamiliar, a place where no one knew her name, where she could breathe without fear of intrusion or confrontation. Her hands rested lightly on her swollen belly as she glanced at the sleeping form of her unborn child, a source of warmth and purpose in the midst of uncertainty. She had left behind a luxurious life, but the cost of staying had become unbearable. Settling into a modest apartment was a challenge in itself. Every decision, from rent to groceries, from baby essentials to medical care, was calculated with care, a balancing act that left little room for error. Loneliness pressed in during the quiet evenings, and she often found herself staring out the window, imagining Lucas waking to an empty home, wondering if he would ever understand the gravity of his actions. Yet she could not dwell on him. Her focus had shifted entirely to the life growing within her and the protection of that fragile new existence. Flashbacks haunted her at times, vivid reminders of the emotional neglect that had led her here. She remembered Lucas missing doctor's appointments, brushing off her concerns about the pregnancy, and prioritizing Isabella Kane over the family they had created. Even small moments, empty reassurances, canceled plans, and half-hearted apologies, now crystallized into a clear pattern of indifference. The betrayal had not been sudden, it had been built over months, a slow erosion of trust that left her no choice but to act decisively. Despite the hardships, Evelyn's resilience shone through. She established routines for herself and her unborn child, ensuring safety, stability, and quiet happiness. She made friends cautiously, choosing only those she could trust, and she carefully planned for the arrival of her baby, preparing a nursery filled with love and hope rather than fear. Her maternal instincts guided every decision, her determination shaping a life that, while far from the comfort of the past, was grounded in security, independence, and the unshakable promise that her child would never endure the neglect she had suffered. Evelyn had walked away from betrayal, but she had not walked away from hope. She was building a life that was truly hers, brick by careful brick. Lucas sat alone in his study, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, mirroring the darkness that had settled over his heart. The penthouse felt empty, hollow without Evelyn's presence, the absence of her warmth and the soft anticipation of their unborn child pressing on him like a physical weight. For the first time, he allowed himself to confront the truth he had long avoided. His choices had not only betrayed Evelyn but had endangered the very family he claimed to love. The realization was crushing. Isabella Kane, the thrill, the excitement, none of it had been worth this loss. Every fleeting moment with her now seemed trivial compared to the life he had allowed to slip through his fingers. He remembered the nights he had ignored Evelyn's calls, the prenatal appointments he had skipped, and the countless broken promises that had slowly chipped away at her trust. Each memory was a dagger, a reminder that his selfishness had consequences far beyond the immediate satisfaction of infidelity. The betrayal had not been a single act, it was a pattern of disregard, a choice to prioritize desire over duty, excitement over responsibility. The depth of Evelyn's hurt became painfully clear, and he felt a twinge of guilt sharper than anything he had experienced before. As he reflected, a subtle shift began within him, the stirrings of emotional growth. He realized that responsibility could not be selective, that accountability was not optional, and that the child he had helped create needed a father who would prioritize their well-being above all else. The life he had taken for granted, the warmth of family dinners, the small moments of laughter, the anticipation of holding his child, was not a guarantee, it had been a gift he had squandered. For the first time, Lucas understood that change required more than regret. Words alone could not repair the fracture in his family. He needed consistent actions, humility, and a steadfast commitment to prove that he had learned from his failures. Isabella's influence had ended, and with that void came clarity. He could no longer chase selfish desires. If he wanted redemption, if he wanted even a chance to restore the bond with Evelyn and be present for his child, he had to confront his mistakes head-on, embrace accountability fully, and prioritize the family he had once betrayed above all else. Lucas sat at his desk late into the night, carefully selecting stationery and crafting letters he hoped would reach Evelyn without overwhelming her. Each word was weighed, each sentence designed to convey sincerity, accountability, and genuine remorse. He included memories of shared joy, acknowledgments of his failures, and promises to prioritize both her well-being and that of their unborn child. Alongside the letters, he arranged small gifts, soft blankets for the baby, a book he remembered Evelyn had wanted to read during her pregnancy, and a few thoughtful items that reflected his attentiveness to her needs. Every gesture was deliberate, a way to show that he had reflected deeply on his mistakes and was prepared to act differently. Evelyn noticed these signs almost immediately. A carefully wrapped gift left at her door, a handwritten note slipped under the apartment's entrance, small, unobtrusive attempts to communicate. At first, she felt a flicker of surprise and curiosity, her heart softening momentarily at the recognition that Lucas was trying. But the shadow of past betrayal loomed large, and caution quickly overtook any initial warmth. She had seen his promises before, felt the emptiness behind his reassurances, and endured the consequences of his infidelity with Isabella Kane. Skepticism anchored her heart, reminding her that gestures alone could not repair the deep hurt she had suffered. The emotional tension between them grew quietly, a palpable undercurrent in every interaction, no matter how indirect. Lucas understood that he could not rush reconciliation, he needed to prove consistency, not just offer words or material reminders. Each letter, each thoughtful gift, each carefully timed message was a test, a way for him to demonstrate that his remorse was real, that he was capable of sustained change, and that his priority had shifted from selfish desires to accountability in family. For Evelyn, these gestures were both a temptation and a trial. She longed to hope, to imagine that Lucas had truly transformed, but she braced herself against disappointment. The process was slow and deliberate, a tense dance of proving and judging, each side cautiously navigating the fragile possibility of a renewed bond while carrying the weight of past pain and betrayal. Lucas wandered through the crowded park, the crisp air brushing against his face, when a familiar sight stopped him in his tracks. Across the fountain, bundled in a warm coat, was Evelyn Harper, her hand resting protectively on the small stroller beside her. His heart skipped, a flood of emotions crashing over him, regret for the months he had squandered, longing for the family he had betrayed, hope that perhaps she might allow a conversation, and fear of rejection. For a moment, he felt rooted to the spot, unsure whether to approach or remain hidden, letting the moment pass. Evelyn, aware of his gaze, tensed immediately. Her protective instincts flared as she gently adjusted the blanket around her child, positioning him between them. She studied Lucas carefully, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the hesitancy in his steps, and the vulnerability in his eyes. Years of betrayal and neglect had taught her caution, every instinct told her to guard herself, to test his intentions before allowing him any proximity. She did not speak, did not invite him closer, but the subtle shift in her posture was a silent signal that she was alert, evaluating, weighing the possibility of interaction. For Lucas, seeing them together was both a reward and a torment. He recognized the consequences of his past actions, the distance he had created, the pain he had inflicted, and the resentment that lingered in her measured movements. Isabella Kane's shadow, once a symbol of excitement, now only reminded him of the family he had nearly lost entirely. As he stepped forward cautiously, words caught in his throat, the weight of months of mistakes pressing down. Both confronted the lingering pain, the betrayal, and the fractured trust, each aware that this encounter was more than chance, it was a test. A fragile opportunity to gauge whether reconciliation could ever be possible, and whether the walls of hurt Evelyn had built could ever be lowered. Lucas took a deep breath, the crisp evening air carrying the scent of pine from a nearby holiday market. He stepped closer to Evelyn, his hands slightly trembling, his gaze fixed on her carefully guarded expression. "Evelyn," he began, voice low but steady, "I need to speak to you. I know I have no right, but I owe you everything, honesty, accountability, and an explanation." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, wary and guarded. "I'm listening," she said cautiously, her voice steady but laced with tension. Caleb shifted slightly in the stroller, sensing the seriousness of the moment. The months of betrayal and neglect loomed heavily between them, a silent barrier that could not be crossed lightly. Lucas spoke, his words deliberate. "I failed you. I failed our child before he was even born. I was selfish, consumed by my desires and my obsession with Isabella Kane. I ignored your needs, skipped appointments, broke promises. I betrayed your trust in every way possible. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to prove that I have changed." His voice faltered slightly, the weight of confession making his chest ache. Evelyn's emotions surged, anger, grief, disbelief. You think words are enough? She demanded, tears welling in her eyes. Do you know how it felt, Lucas, to be abandoned, ignored, while you chose her over me, over our family? I know, he admitted, his own eyes glistening. I see it now, clearer than ever. She is no longer in my life. Isabella is gone. I've ended all contact, and I am committed to putting you and our child first. I want to rebuild the trust one destroyed, step by step, with patience, honesty, and accountability. I understand that it will take time, and I am willing to prove my change every single day. Evelyn studied him carefully, testing the sincerity behind his words. She observed the tension in his posture, the way he avoided defensiveness, the genuine remorse that softened his eyes. Slowly, she allowed herself to listen, to measure not just the promises he made but the evident commitment in his demeanor. The confrontation, though raw and emotional, became a turning point. Isabella's influence erased, Lucas fully accountable, and the possibility of rebuilding a fractured family beginning to take root in the fragile space between words and actions. Evelyn sat by the window of her modest apartment, the soft glow of the city lights reflecting off the glass. Caleb slept soundly in the crib, a sense of calm and vulnerability surrounding him that made her chest ache with protective instinct. Her mind raced with the decisions she faced. Should she maintain her independence, safeguarding herself and her unborn child, or consider allowing Lucas back into their lives under strict terms? Each option carried weight, consequences, and the potential to shape the future in profoundly different ways. She reflected on the months of pain, the betrayal, and the emotional neglect she had endured. Lucas's affair with Isabella Kane had shattered the foundation of trust, leaving scars that could not be ignored. She remembered the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the feeling of being invisible in her own home while he prioritized someone else. Yet, juxtaposed against that pain were glimpses of change, his consistent efforts to show accountability, his severed ties with Isabella, the sincerity in his apologies, and the thoughtfulness behind every gesture he had made toward her and the unborn child. Evelyn realized that rebuilding trust would not be simple or immediate. It would require clear boundaries, measurable consistency, and her own willingness to monitor his actions carefully. She understood that allowing Lucas a place in their lives did not mean surrendering her independence. It meant cautiously opening the door to the possibility of a healthier, more honest family dynamic. After hours of contemplation, she made her decision. Lucas would have the opportunity to be part of their lives, but on her terms, guided by boundaries that ensured her and her child's safety and emotional well-being. She would remain vigilant, requiring consistent proof of his change before fully allowing herself to trust. For the first time in months, a quiet sense of control and empowerment settled over her, affirming that she was making a choice grounded in both love and self-preservation. Lucas arrived promptly each morning, not as a demand but as a commitment, ensuring that Evelyn never felt unsupported. He took an active role in preparing for the baby, attending doctor appointments, discussing feeding schedules, and helping set up the nursery. Every action was deliberate, a tangible demonstration that he was prioritizing their family above all else. Gone were the nights of distraction, the hurried excuses, and the secretive behavior. In their place were reliability, patience, and thoughtful involvement. Communication became the cornerstone of their tentative rebuilding. Lucas learned to listen without defensiveness, to validate Evelyn's feelings, and to discuss plans openly, acknowledging her autonomy while offering support. Conflicts, when they arose, were met with calm discussion rather than avoidance, and every decision about the child was approached collaboratively. Evelyn observed these patterns closely, recognizing the difference between hollow gestures and sustained effort, the subtle cues that indicated Lucas was committed to changing not for appearances, but for the well-being of their family. The slow reconstruction of trust was both challenging and necessary. Evelyn remained cautious, mindful of the months of betrayal that had preceded this period, but she began to notice the consistency in Lucas's behavior. Small victories, showing up on time, following through on promises, and demonstrating emotional availability, accumulated into a pattern that could not be ignored. She allowed herself moments of hope, seeing that his transformation was not fleeting or superficial but rooted in genuine accountability and a renewed sense of responsibility. Through shared parenting, open dialogue, and consistent care, the foundation for a healthier relationship was being rebuilt. Lucas's commitment was evident not just in words but in actions, creating an environment of safety, respect, and love. Evelyn, while still cautious, began to trust again, recognizing that redemption required both patience and proof, and that the man she had loved, and who had once betrayed her, was capable of becoming the father and partner their family deserved. Months later, Evelyn moved through her home with a quiet confidence, her hands often resting on her growing belly as she hummed softly while preparing for the baby's arrival. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt both safe and empowering. She was emotionally stable, independent, and deeply attuned to the needs of her unborn child. Every decision she made reflected her determination to create a nurturing environment, free from the chaos and betrayal of the past. Lucas had remained a consistent presence, attending appointments, helping with preparations, and prioritizing communication with Evelyn. His actions reflected a deeper understanding of responsibility and the consequences of his past mistakes. Each small gesture, checking in, respecting boundaries, participating actively in planning for the baby, reinforced the transformation she had cautiously begun to trust. Isabella Kane's presence was fully erased from their lives. The chapter of betrayal had been definitively closed, leaving space for honesty, accountability, and genuine connection. Together, they navigated this delicate period with care, rebuilding not only trust but also the foundation for a healthier family dynamic. Evelyn's vigilance remained, but hope began to flourish alongside it, a quiet assurance that the future could be different. The story of loss, betrayal, and heartbreak had given way to redemption, resilience, and healing. For Evelyn, Lucas, and the soon-to-arrive child, the path forward promised love, honesty, and the possibility of a family grounded in respect, accountability, and enduring connection, a future they could finally embrace with cautious optimism.